Indiano, economista de formação, Pavan Sukhdev fez carreira no setor financeiro. Em 2008, resolve tirar uma licença do Deutsche Bank para liderar a iniciativa Economia Verde, encabeçada pelo Programa das Nações Unidas para o Meio Ambiente. O relatório TEB, The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, que avalia os benefícios econômicos mundiais da biodiversidade, é o seu trabalho mais famoso. Com essa publicação, Pavan fez avançar muito o debate sobre a economia e recursos naturais, criando a contabilidade do capital natural, que adiciona o valor das riquezas naturais aos tradicionais cálculos econômicos. Em 2012, Sukhdev avançou ainda mais na análise sobre o mundo dos negócios, com o seu livro Movimento Corporação 2020. Nele, o economista defende impostos mais elevados com base no impacto ambiental, para estimular nas atividades econômicas a inovação verde. O indiano esteve no Brasil em maio de 2013 para lançar a edição brasileira de seu livro, publicado pelo selo Planeta Sustentável da editora Abril, e conversou com exclusividade com o programa Capital Natural sobre sua trajetória e suas propostas para uma sociedade direcionada ao desenvolvimento sustentável. Eu queria agradecer a sua presença no nosso programa, dias depois de ter lançado no Brasil o livro Corporação 2020, e realmente fazer algumas perguntas sobre os temas que estão nesse livro. Na sua opinião, qual é a conexão entre a crise ambiental e a crise financeira que nós vivemos, sobretudo essa de 2008?
Well, firstly, both the crises, the environmental crisis and the economic crisis, have a common cause, which is our failed economic model. It's a model which believes in a take, make, waste system of production and consumption. We consume without fear of consequences, we produce without any awareness of impacts, and we assume that somehow in a finite planet, infinite growth is possible. And I think none of this is really feasible. So we create the risks and the circumstances in which we are hitting, and sometimes dangerously, planetary boundaries, whether these boundaries are in the nature of climate emissions or freshwater usage or ocean acidification or phosphorus scarcity and so on. And at the same time, I think we create risks not recognizing the significance of the corporation in driving these factors, because our brown economy, which is what it is right now, is actually consisting of a lot of corporations working purely in self-interest, not conscious sometimes, and certainly not careful about their externalities. So these externalities pile up, very often in the form of risks, which are credit risks, which are drivers of recessions. And you can see that the driver of these externalities is the profit purpose of the corporation, taking on risks, achieving income sometimes, doing well sometimes, but sometimes creating complex disasters for which the costs are not necessarily borne by the corporation or the private sector, but borne by the government and the taxpayer. So I think these are connected crises, common causes, hopefully common solutions.
Na sua opinião, quais são os mais afetados pela crise ambiental? Quem sofre mais? E se você pode dar alguns exemplos sobre isso?
I think the most seriously affected by environmental crises are in fact the poor. Now let's take an example. I mean, if the local forest dies away or is destroyed, whose crops would suffer because of the lack of flow of water from the forests and nutrients from the forests to the fields of the farms? That's the poor farmer. I mean, whose wife would not be able to go into the forest to collect fuel wood to cook? Again, the poor farmer's wife. And whose cows and goats would not be able to collect leaf litter to eat? Again, the poor farmer. So when we think about it, we wonder, well, these losses of forests don't impact GDP. That's because they are invisible in two ways. Not only because nature is invisible and the services it provides are invisible, because we also forget the value of those invisible services to the household of the poor. So that's why I say that don't just measure ecosystem services as a percentage of GDP. Measure them as a percentage of the GDP of the poor. And then you'll find they could be 50, 70, 90%.
Já que o senhor mencionou o Produto Nacional Bruto, Como é que o senhor vê o Produto Nacional Bruto como uma medida de progresso e crescimento?
I think GDP is an extremely bad measure of progress. And frankly, all that GDP does is measure the final value of goods and services produced in an economy. It doesn't tell you anything about what's happening to human health, human education, what is happening to the wealth of the poor. At the end of the day, development is about providing more wealth and more income in the hands of the poor. GDP doesn't give you a measure of that. It doesn't measure distribution. So I think in many different ways, GDP is weak. And last but not the least, nature's services are invisible as far as GDP is concerned. So that is also missing.
Numa economia verde, como seria o consumo? Qual seria o perfil do consumo numa economia verde?
Well, you see, a green economy is one where you can achieve well-being and better social equity without actually negatively impacting environmental risks and ecological scarcities. So the consumption that comes with the green economy is aligned to that purpose. So you will find consumption goods being designed so that their impact is minimized, so that recycling is part of the process of design, so that the end product, the waste, so to speak, is actually the input of some other process and some other product. These elements of green products are actually part of the design process. And therefore, you will find consumption in green economies, but you will find its impacts are much, much less. That's the nature of it.
Numa economia globalizada, a queda de consumo dos países mais ricos não afetaria as chances de crescimento ou de melhoria dos países mais pobres?
It's certainly true that, when consumption declines in wealthy economies, that there is an impact on the poor. For instance, if people in London stop giving flowers to their girlfriends and their boyfriends or their husbands and wives, that means that the farmers in Kenya who grow those flowers would suffer. And in fact, this was the kind of effect that was visible in the last recession in 2008. But at the same time, it's also true that some of that consumption is of a kind, such as it causes global warming or it causes freshwater scarcity, which is actually negatively impacting the poor as well. So, there isn't any clear one answer, yes or no, that yes, always a decline in wealthy country consumption is a cost to poor countries. Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Vamos para o intervalo e daqui a pouco voltaremos para conversar de novo com Pavan Sukhdev sobre a economia verde. Estamos de volta com o Capital Natural, ouvindo hoje Pavan Sukhdev. Num dos seus mais importantes relatórios, há uma menção sobre o custo da destruição ambiental, que seria de 2,5 a 4,5 trilhões de dólares. Como foi possível alcançar essas cifras?
Yes, it's an estimate, but it's a complex estimate. So, you have to work out mainly the ecosystem services that forests deliver in that particular example. For instance, the carbon storage of forests. And you know how much that is worth because of the cost of damage thanks to climate change that would happen otherwise. Then you work out how much is the rate of loss of those forests and therefore to what extent that is increasing with time, and other services that forests provide, like freshwater provision, like biodiversity, ecotourism. And you also look at other biomes like coral reefs, what the loss of those coral reefs would cause as a result of lost livelihoods, incomes, and so on. And then once again, you forecast the rate of loss of those biomes. Coral reefs losses are happening. So it's a combination of forecasts of losses and a combination of the present values of the various ecosystem services, as we call it, of these biomes. Yeah.
Existe mercado da biodiversidade? Como é que ele trabalha? Como é que ele funciona?
There are actually not many biodiversity markets in place. I think there is more hype than practice on this matter. There are many examples of economic mechanisms like payments for ecosystem services or eco-certification or indeed legal agreements and conservation agreements. Markets for ecosystem services could be like the biodiversity markets in Australia, conservation is rewarded, or like the wetland markets in the US where impacts on one wetland by a company can be offset by restoring other wetlands. So there are these markets, and then that restoration can be traded. One person does it versus another company does it. So these are two small examples.
There is a carbon market as well, not so strong.
Yeah, the carbon market is dying away, but and we hope we can resurrect it, but it doesn't look very hopeful right now. Yeah.
Durante a Rio+20, houve alguns protestos e ceticismo dos militantes, temendo que a concentração de renda e injustiça, ao dar valor econômico à natureza, traria mais problemas do que resolveria. Como você responde a isso?
You see, firstly, I would recognize that this is a real problem because property rights matter. And what tends to happen is that in making decisions on conservation strategies, protection strategies, and so on, it has been the case that many governments have ignored the rights of local communities. So I think the first is to recognize that this is a real problem, and the second is to address it, which is saying, okay, if local communities need to be given rights, let's look at it. In fact, recently in a Supreme Court judgment in India, in the famous case of the Niyamgiri Hills, which were mined by Vedanta Resources, an aluminium mining company, that was banned, that was stopped by the government, but finally the court ruled that it was the local community which had the right to decide what to do with the forest where it believes a spiritual existence, where it believes its deity resides. So, you have to recognize that there are different ways of looking at forests, especially where local communities reside and where they have an emotional and spiritual link.
Dos mais importantes acordos firmados, a Convenção da Biodiversidade, propõe uma distribuição justa e igualitária dos benefícios. Mas aqui no Brasil, que é um país muito biodiverso, rico em biodiversidade, as companhias acham que é uma espécie de pesadelo essa expressão justa e igualitária, porque elas não sabem exatamente quem são aqueles que devem ser beneficiados. Como é que o senhor vê esse problema?
It is really difficult to say what is just and equitable, what is fair and equitable. And frankly, you cannot just leave it to markets to determine prices for what is fair and equitable, because the equation between the large company which wishes to extract value from genetic resources and probably the local community or local landowners who wish to provide that value, it's not an equal equation. Economic power resides in the multinational corporation. Economic power does not reside in the local community. So it will be very difficult for there to be a fair exchange, if you like. So this is where international and local government involvement in pricing becomes important. But the moment you do that, then you get howls of protest saying, oh, you are against market practices, etc., etc. Well, that's reality. In the absence of deep and liquid markets, in the absence of a market that indicates a fair price and what is a fair price, I'm afraid intervention is needed, and I think that's what perhaps complicates matters further when it comes to ABS, access and benefit sharing.
Alguns observadores acham que o mecanismo de desenvolvimento limpo, esse formulado no contexto do Protocolo de Kyoto, fracassou. Como evitar que esse fracasso se estenda a outras tentativas de integrar o capital natural na nossa economia?
The Clean Development Mechanism began with a very positive and sensible purpose, that provide developing countries with the ability to reduce their emissions, and for that reduction in emissions, reward them. And this was implemented at the corporate level, so at the level of the corporation, which is the way it should be. But unfortunately, two things went wrong. One is the sheer variety of methodologies, the sheer number of ways in which this could be done just grew out of proportion. And secondly, the complexity wasn't managed. In other words, it wasn't made simple. And an example of this number of methods was the whole idea of HCFC 23, essentially a gas which is part of the refrigeration process, was given benefits, CDM benefits, and in fact a scandal arose in the Far East where the compound was being produced only to be offset. So massive benefits were being collected for no reason other than to collect CDM charges. So you have to be careful about managing such complexities, and therefore really one has to focus on what's possible and what's reasonable. And perhaps the third element of my dissatisfaction with the CDM is that we never really got green carbon inside this system. So for a while there was some degree of effort to take offsets thanks to reforestation and so on. But unfortunately, the linking mechanism between the European Union and green carbon never took place, and a directive was changed. So the net result is that we didn't have the world's largest carbon market actually recognizing reduced deforestation or afforestation. And I think that was an opportunity lost. Hopefully, now with REDD+, we will try and cover up that lost opportunity, but we've lost time in the process.
Would you add to this answer the fact that the economical crisis gave some fear to invest in this field of carbon?
Well, you see, the investment in carbon was always a boutique investment, very much a specialized investment. So what was happening in the major economy truly, in my opinion, did not make much of a difference here, because it was always meant for a specialist investor.
Okay. Yeah. Bom, então vamos encerrando esse bloco e daqui a pouco voltaremos a conversar sobre a economia verde e todos esses problemas que envolvem as grandes negociações internacionais sobre o meio ambiente e a superação do processo de instabilidade que vivemos. Voltamos a discutir agora a economia verde com Pavan Sukhdev, agora falando sobre a iniciativa de recuperação do mundo depois da crise de 2008. A sua experiência como participante da iniciativa econômica verde foi uma experiência no sentido também de superar ou apresentar uma alternativa para a crise financeira internacional. Essa alternativa foi bem sucedida? Até que ponto a economia esverdeou depois da crise financeira internacional?
Well, you know what they say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So to have done nothing with that would have been a waste. And I think it's good that people got their heads together and thought that let's present a global Green New Deal, modeled on the original New Deal of the early 1930s in the US in response to the Great Recession, the Great Depression actually. And I think what it did achieve is a focus on what was wrong with our economic model, that it did not recognize natural capital, that it did not reward with labor, and jobs were scarce. So the fact that it did not reward with labor the reconstruction of natural capital, the fact that it was driven by a corporate sector which was still targeting private profits at the expense of public losses. These issues came up to the front. So in that sense, I think the crisis achieved a positive purpose of educating policymakers, educating corporate leaders that yes, there really was a problem with the economic model. It's not business as usual anymore.
Eu vou te fazer uma pergunta que fazem muitos empresários. É lucrativa uma empresa sustentável?
You know, people sometimes create a sense of victory that yes, we have found a correlation or we have found a causality between sustainable behavior and profitability. And sometimes I like to remind them that this is because good management tends to be both profitable and sustainable. It's just the quality of good management. So you will find that there are many companies who, by researching and exploring the opportunities, will actually pick up the so-called $20 bills that are lying on the sidewalk. Yeah, the idea that there is free money is disputed by economists, but the reality is there are many, many opportunities for managers, sustainable, non-sustainable opportunities. Which ones you pick to spend the hours of your day will determine whether your company moves in a sustainable direction or a non-sustainable direction. It's the choice you make. You can focus on changing industrial processes, achieving energy efficiency, and reducing costs, and creating new products for responsible consumers, or you can choose to just grab bigger market shares of the brown market. Both will take you 5 hours a day. Question is, as a manager, what is your choice? And that's the difference, because you need to make that choice, and it's your choice. You decide which way it goes.
Se você pudesse magicamente encontrar gatilho para acionar a economia verde, qual seria ele?
I think the biggest trigger I would put in place is to understand that the one big driver of the brown economy is the corporation, and the reason it's driving that is because its true performance is not being measured. Externalities of the corporation are simply not being measured, and you cannot manage what you do not measure. And if we could do that, I think that would be the one big thing that I would ask to change. Measure true performance.
Na Rio+20, na Conferência do Rio de Janeiro, você lançou um movimento chamado Corporação 2020, que, aliás, é o tema desse livro que ele acaba de lançar no Brasil. Você pode me falar um pouco sobre as motivações e o objetivo dessa campanha?
Well, you see, around the time of Rio, we had already launched the Green Economy Report. It was more than a year and a half ago. And yet I could see no real change towards the green economy, despite the fact that almost 25 countries had started work on transitioning to a green economy. And I realized the cause of this problem was that we hadn't focused enough on what change is needed in the engine of the economy. 3/4 in the US, 3/4 of GDP and jobs are private sector. Globally, 60% of GDP and 70% of jobs are private sector. Now, if you want to change economic direction and resource use, how will you do that without changing the engine of your current economic direction and resource use, which is today's corporation, what I call Corporation 1920.
O seu movimento não era apenas destinado aos empresários, mas ele também se destinava às organizações não governamentais, dizendo que elas poderiam contribuir para mudar também toda a atmosfera empresarial. Como assim?
Well, this is really linked to the challenge that I talked about, because the question is, how do you achieve the new corporation to deliver the new green economy? And you need to look at what makes the corporation behave. We tax today the goods, as in creativity and ingenuity for making corporate profits. We don't tax the bads, as in resource extraction and resource use. We ignore the fact that advertising is not well managed and well controlled. It can say almost anything for any purpose and get away with it. We don't explore the cost and the risk and the cost of excessive leverage, of becoming too big to fail. We don't do any of these things, and all of these are aspects of the corporation, and of course, to me the most important, reporting your externalities, measuring and reporting them. So unless we change regulations and make them respond to these realities, how will we achieve a green economy, or for that matter, sustainable development?
Existe algum país no mundo com um sistema regulatório satisfatório?
I think many countries have got elements of good regulation. Your European countries have got regulation on, for instance, cosmetics advertising. They have regulations on food claims in advertising. The European countries have good regulations when it comes to carbon. There is a carbon market. Countries like Sweden have carbon taxes. So I think there are a lot of examples, isolated examples of the right thing taking place in some countries, more in some countries in a different area. But unfortunately, there is not a single country where all my 4 planks of change are being worked upon. Norway has great demonstration of how powerful it is to have a resource tax. They have 78% taxes on petroleum. But not any country has got everything working right, and I think that's the challenge. How do we get the key areas of change across the G20 nations and across major industries? That, I think, is the direction of the future.
Já que estamos falando nisso, nós estamos no Brasil também, que é considerado uma superpotência ecológica, é verdade? Não sei. Que países do mundo, na sua opinião, estão mais propensos a se engajar numa economia verde?
Well, firstly, I've always myself called Brazil the global capital of natural capital. And there's a reason for that. It is the area of the Brazilian rainforest. It is the area of the Amazon. The largest supply of fresh water into the planet, both on land and in the air, comes from here. So it is feeding the rainfall cycle of the planet. And yet I rarely see a single Brazilian politician claiming credit for that and asking the global community to actually reward Brazil for maintaining what is basically the water supply of the planet, or maintaining the largest carbon store of the planet. Yeah, we see a few odd deals like $1 billion from Norway and a bit of REDD+ action, but this should be the key thing that you talk about. In every forum, every G20 meeting, every United Nations meeting, whoever is the president of Brazil or the finance minister of Brazil or the environment minister should be talking about only this. How do we ensure investment in what is a public good for the entire planet, which is being managed by Brazil on behalf of the whole planet? I don't see the dialogue. Why?
Bom, essas foram algumas das mais importantes ideias de Pavan Sukhdev. Eu agradeço a sua presença no nosso programa e esperamos voltar a conversar em breve.
Thank you very much indeed.